Is Israel committing genocide in Gaza? It's a big question that has different definitive answers depending on who you talk to. For many Palestinians and Muslims, as well as many people worldwide who are protesting against Israel's bombing and killing in Gaza, the answer is a clear and obvious yes. If you talk to many Israelis and their supporters, saying yes is either delusional or an anti-Semitic obscenity. The only answer is no. And the instance of one Israeli who yelled at me, something I talk about in this video, link in the description below, it's actually the Palestinians who are trying to commit genocide against Israelis. For me personally as a Palestinian, I haven't weighed in much on whether or not Israel is committing genocide, although many of my relatives and supporters of my channel have described it as such. There are a few reasons for that, one being that I wasn't familiar with the legal definition of genocide. In other words, what the minimum threshold of death and destruction is for something to merit being described as genocide. I also was ignorant about who gets to decide if something is genocide or not. And here's the second key reason. In many important ways, the whole is it or isn't it genocide debate that's been raging for the past year is irrelevant. I explain why I think it's irrelevant at the end of the video. Feel free to skip ahead to it if you'd like. But if I think it's irrelevant, then why make this video, you might ask? Well, let's start with the first step, figuring out if Israel's actions meet the criteria to be called genocide. To do that, I researched what exactly is the definition of genocide, who defines it, and if something is found to be a genocide, what happens next to stop it? The answers I found were, perhaps unsurprisingly, considering this is the subject of Israel and Palestine after all, complex, murky, and oddly, since we're talking about definitions here, very non-definitive. The word genocide itself was coined in 1942 by Polish-Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, and the term is derived from the Greek genos, which means race, tribe, or nation, and the Latin side, which means killing. And colloquially, that's what genocide means: the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group. And then we have the legal definition used by the International Court of Justice, or the ICJ, which is the judicial branch of the United Nations that addresses disputes between countries. The ICJ uses the definition under the Genocide Convention, a treaty that was signed in 1948 and ratified by most countries in the world, including Israel. According to the Genocide Convention, genocide is any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. 1. Killing members of the group. 2. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. 3. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. 4. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. 5. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. A country has to bring genocide charges against another country through the ICJ, and it has to provide evidence that it's the state itself committing the genocide, as opposed to individual citizens or groups of citizens of that state. The accusing country can petition for an interim court order to stop the genocidal violence, but it's important to note that the ICJ has no way of actually enforcing such rulings. The way it's supposed to work is that the Genocide Convention signatories have to accept the ruling since they agreed to the treaty. So how often are things legally recognized as genocide and taken to trial? Very rarely. There's actually only been 3 instances: Pol Pot's mass killings in Cambodia in the 1970s, the 1994 Rwandan genocide, and the 1995 Srebrenica massacre in Bosnia. The Genocide Convention came into being after World War II, which is why atrocities like the Holocaust, the Ukrainian Holodomor, and the Armenian genocide aren't included. So, according to the ICJ definition, is Israel committing genocide in Gaza? If we go through the list, number 1, killing members of the group, well, check. Israel has killed more than 40,000 Palestinians in Gaza since October 7, although this tally has been disputed by Israel supporters, while other Israel supporters have claimed that many of the killed are Hamas fighters, while the civilian victims were killed only because Hamas was embedding itself amongst them, and so their deaths were unavoidable. Number 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of that group. Well, considering that there's been growing numbers of reports on the risk of famine and starvation in Gaza, with 70% of crop fields destroyed, and considering that more than 63% of all buildings in Gaza have been damaged and nearly a third of that total completely and utterly destroyed, as well as all the countless media stories of the suffering and anguish of Palestinian men, women, and children, I'd say Israel causing serious bodily and mental harm is clear to see. This also applies to number 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The Israeli army has forced hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to move to the south of Gaza and is actively creating massive buffer/security zones within Gaza. When you factor this in, including Israel's widely reported blocking of humanitarian aid into Gaza, as well as the physical destruction of homes, schools, streets, businesses, it must be concluded that Israel is deliberately bringing about this group's destruction, at least in part. All, of course, in their eyes, unavoidable collateral in the quest to eradicate Hamas and rescue the Israeli hostages Hamas abducted on October 7. Some of those hostages who've been killed by Israel's military, by the way. Next, numbers 4 and 5. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, I haven't seen any instances where Israel has blatantly done this, so it's the first 3 items in the list that could be used to build that genocide case. But then we go back to the wording of the definition framing the list. Any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part. Now, this is where things get complicated because it is exceedingly hard to explicitly determine there is intent to destroy. That might sound ridiculous at first. When Israel bombs densely populated civilian areas, knowing they're filled with civilians, is that not intent? When Israel blocks humanitarian aid, is that not intent? When Israel forces civilians to leave their homes, their neighborhoods, their livelihoods to live as refugees in tents in perpetuity, is that not intent? But Israel could argue all of these things with some other justification. Israel killed civilians not because it wanted to, but because Hamas is hiding amongst them. Israel is blocking aid, but perhaps because those aid routes are potentially being used to smuggle in weapons. Israel is forcing Palestinians to leave their homes in order to protect them. I'll give you a simple example of why intent is important. There's a difference between the intent in bombing a building filled with civilians to kill, let's say, a terrorist leader, all while knowing civilians will likely get killed but viewing those deaths as unfortunate collateral, and the intent in bombing a building specifically to kill all of its occupants, civilians, and enemy combatants. Clear intent from the Bosnian Serb perpetrators of the Srebrenica massacre of Bosniak Muslim men and boys is what led to their actions being legally ruled as a genocide. And the same goes for the Hutus who committed the genocide of the Tutsis in Rwanda. On the radio, they blatantly expressed intent to eradicate their victims, infamously calling the Tutsis cockroaches or snakes that must be exterminated. And this was back in the 1990s, but we're now in the 2020s. In this day and age, with social media seemingly sharing everything everyone is saying all the time, there's no way Israeli political leaders would say things that exhibit clear intent to destroy, even if that was what they were planning. There's no way they'd be that stupid, right? Well, soon after the Hamas attack, the Israeli defense minister at the time, Yoav Gallant, said this.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
And Israel Katz, the current defense minister, said, no electric switch will be turned on, no water tap will be opened, and no fuel truck would enter Gaza until the hostages were returned. In other words, all Palestinians in Gaza would be collectively punished. There's the Israeli president Isaac Herzog who said an entire nation out there is responsible for Hamas's October 7 attack. And then, of course, there's Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, who in multiple public statements regarding Hamas referenced a passage in the Hebrew Bible that called for the Israelites to completely destroy their attackers, the Amalekites, to blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven in retribution. Does that qualify as genocidal intent? The devil's in the details, of course. For every person who says these words from Israel's highest political leaders obviously reflects genocidal intent, especially given the extent of the death and destruction inflicted on Gaza. There are others who will say that these are isolated instances from a small number of individuals, that they were emotionally charged words in the heat of the moment, or a little more far-fetched that these words were directed specifically at Hamas and not all Palestinians. But I want you to reflect on these statements from Israeli leaders as more and more reports come out about the dehumanizing attitude and language from everyday Israelis, in how many of them view Palestinians as this monolithic group bent on destroying them, similar to how the Hutu genocide perpetrators viewed the Tutsis. Consider how Israeli soldiers were recorded laughing and mockingly singing as they watched an airstrike in Gaza.
We have verified this video of an Israeli drone strike near the coast. The people watching, believed to be soldiers, laugh as one of them sings the final countdown.
Or how Israeli soccer fans of the club Maccabi Tel Aviv were recently recorded chanting, "Why is school out in Gaza? There are no children left there." So how have experts on the subject of genocide weighed in on this? Well, the news publication Vox posted an article a month after the October 7 attack last year to ask several experts whether or not Israel's retaliation in Gaza could be categorized as genocide. Many were hesitant to describe it as genocide back then, but when Vox revisited the genocide question a year later, this past October, the reluctance appears to have gone away in the face of mounting evidence. Adam Jones, a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia, who's written a textbook on genocide, said, "Any early hesitation I had about applying the genocide label to the Israeli attack on Gaza has dissipated over the past year of human slaughter and the obliteration of homes, infrastructure, and communities." Jones also added that Israel's plans to expel the entire remaining civilian population of northern Gaza and turn the territory into a military zone where no aid would be allowed and where there was no indication of whether civilians would ever be allowed to return could be an example of state or organizational plan or policy needed to prove genocidal intent. What appeared to sway many of the reluctant experts was Israel's ongoing ground offensive in the southern Gaza town of Rafah that started this past May. For months prior, Israel was forcing Palestinian civilians further and further south to collect in what it called safe zones in and around Rafah, which is along the Egyptian border. The idea would be that with civilians there, it could focus on eradicating Hamas in the north. But, as Vox reports, by August, approximately 44% of all buildings in Rafah were damaged or destroyed by bombing. Israel also shut down the Rafah border crossing, cutting off the entry of humanitarian aid. There were even reports of Israel's military killing civilians camping in tents in a humanitarian zone, and then recorded air attacks like this one. The ICJ ordered Israel to stop its offensive, but Israel condemned the ruling and said it was open to interpretation. And then there's Raz Siegel, a US-based Israeli professor of Holocaust and genocide studies, who called Israel's actions a textbook case of genocide days into Israel's retaliation after October 7. In 2024, he felt much the same, stating, "I fully stand behind my description of Israel's attack on Gaza as a textbook case of genocide because we're still actually seeing nearly a year into this genocidal assault, explicit and unashamed statements of intent to destroy. The way that intent is expressed here is absolutely unprecedented. This was the majority view of the scholars interviewed, but one scholar disagreed. Dov Waxman, a professor of political science and Israel studies at UCLA, initially said that calling Israel's actions genocide stretched the concept too far and emptied it of any meaning, a view that I've seen from many people who don't support Israel's actions but think using the word genocide is an exaggeration for what they see as the sadly normal reality of civilians dying in a conflict, and some have even said calling it a genocide is disrespectful to the victims of the Holocaust. 1 year later, Waxman described Israel's actions as too often brutal, inhumane, and indiscriminate, and yet it still didn't meet the necessary legal criteria for genocide. He added that a few horrendous public statements made by Israeli political leaders wasn't enough. I've left a link to the full Vox article in the description below if you'd like to read it. Beyond those experts, there's a growing consensus that this is genocide. But it all comes back to that issue of proving intent. Israeli political leaders have said some horrible things, and yet I do wonder, similar to Waxman, if their statements show a clear intent to commit genocide. Then again, what are we expecting here? PR-conscious and propaganda-savvy Israeli politicians to publicly admit what they might actually be doing and what end goals they have in mind besides eradicating Hamas? How many politicians have ever done that, especially when it comes to military actions and killing civilians? Ultimately, though, I'm still not 100% sure Israel's actions count as genocide, as per the legal definition from the Genocide Convention, although I am starting to approach that 100% certainty as I witness Israel's ongoing brutality in removing the population and infrastructure from big chunks of Gaza, and with the more recent news that it has banned the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is a primary provider of humanitarian aid for Palestinians in Gaza. That brings me to the key point I touched on in the beginning of the video. Does Israel's actions being legally defined as genocide or not actually matter in the end? Because whether or not it is genocide, the on-the-ground reality is still the same. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have died, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have lost their homes, their communities, with no knowledge of when or if they'll ever be able to return. For me, these things are wrong. They're reflections of an oppressive system run by Israel for decades that kills Palestinians needlessly and strips them of basic rights and freedoms. That's what matters, and that's what needs to change, regardless of what word we use to describe Israel's actions. Change is the key word, not genocide. There are Israelis who say this whole debate is a deflection from their reality on the ground, that Hamas militants killed approximately 1,200 Israelis on October 7 and kidnapped hundreds of hostages, that many Palestinians are calling for the deaths of more Israelis and the eradication of Israel itself. I am not the only Palestinian who thinks these things are wrong, and the attitude of those other Palestinians who call for Israel's destruction needs to change. But this accusation of a deflection is, well, it's a deflection. Hamas's attack and the beliefs of many Palestinians who supported the attack don't justify an apartheid state or genocide. There will be those who say this is all Hamas's fault, as if Israel had no choice but to do exactly what it's been doing. To those people I say, yes, Israel did have other choices, but it refused to follow them. Perhaps to not show weakness, perhaps to lash out in anger and in revenge, but ultimately they chose a path that will make things worse and not better. And then there are those who say that calling Israel's actions genocide does matter, even if the ICJ doesn't have any power to stop Israel, even in the case that it ends up finding Israel's leaders guilty. It matters in the court of public opinion, in shaping how people all over the world view Israel and Palestine. And that's where they have a good point. We're witnessing a PR battle because the word genocide carries a lot of weight. The word outrages and shocks people at a deep emotional level. In this PR battle, Israel's leaders will do whatever they can to avoid the genocide label, while many critics of Israel, Palestinians, and others will do whatever they can to pin the genocide label on Israel. This battle could change a lot in terms of the political, financial, and military support Israel receives right now. This is definitely true, and yet, I still worry that all this arguing over the word can be a distraction, when what matters most, once again, is the realities on the ground. As a Palestinian, I believe what matters most is a positive change to those realities on the ground, and Israel being found guilty of genocide is secondary to that. If enough evidence to determine that guilt is found, I will of course support efforts to bring Israel's leaders to justice. But whether or not that ever happens, let's focus on change. Israel has the upper hand and the power to change its oppressive system and its use of indiscriminate violence, and that is the only thing that will lead to peace. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. You can also support the channel through Patreon or PayPal. Links are in the description below. I'm Secular Spirit, and I'll be back with another video very soon.